So welcome. I'm Katerina Dunavi. I'm the Deputy Director for the Center. We have the great honor of welcoming here Professor Robert Mellon, who came from Greece for a PhD Viva yesterday and for this brilliant seminar today. Professor Mellon is at the School of Psychology of Pantheon University in Athens, a professor in experimental clinical psychology. He established the Laboratory of Experimental and Applied Behavior Analysis there, and he is the founder or the establisher of behavior analysis in Greece. He has a number of really important textbooks on behavior analysis written in Greek that are key to students at undergraduate and postgraduate level there, and he's just one of his very important contributions throughout the years is that he's the past president of the European Association for Behavior Analysis, and I could continue talking for a while, but I think these are just some key points for you to know how big a name we have today with us. So I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Katerina. Good morning. Good morning. Yes, good morning. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for braving the inclement weather. As Katerina mentioned, I do work in clinical and experimental psychology. I trained in, I was born in New York City and trained in the States, chiefly at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where I was a student in both the experimental analysis behavior program and the clinical psychology program. So the operant behavior laboratory was on the 6th floor, and the clinic was on the 3rd floor. So on the 6th floor, I would change a pigeon, and then I would go down to the 3rd floor and see a client, and then go back up to the 6th floor and change a pigeon, back down to the other floor, to the 3rd floor to see a client. And I found no conflict between the two activities. For me, it's exactly the same behavior at two different levels of analysis, two different levels of confidence, and two different levels of significance. The clinical work much more significant, but it's much more hard to see what's going on and what is effective and not effective in what you're doing. And of course, in the experimental analysis behavior, it's the opposite. It's a behavior of no importance to anybody, but we can see how behavior is except for me, of course, or the researcher, but it is a way of isolating behavior-environment relations that are then useful for interpreting events that are occurring under uncontrolled circumstances. So it's, for me, the same activity in both of those circumstances. So I've been doing both of these kinds of work for a long time. And in our laboratory in Athens, we have, it's a small laboratory, but we have 3 different facilities in the laboratory. We have a playroom in which we do experimental research with autistic children. We have a human operant laboratory in which I do studies of the effects of punishment with mostly with undergraduate student subjects, participants. And then we have a pigeon lab in which we are testing very much the same sorts of processes that we're testing with in the human operant lab. English is my native language, but I have trouble speaking it anymore. So if I need a word, I'm glad I have several Greek speakers here to help me out. In the course of that work, I think it's critically important as if you're doing clinical psychology with clinical psychotherapy with adult clients or with adolescents, and also work with problems in childhood like fears and obsessions and so forth. It's very, very important to have a very clear understanding of punishment and the effects of punishment. Of course, we don't use punishment procedures in the psychotherapy practice, but you do have to expose psychotherapy clients to events that are aversive in order to talk about it, in order to get past it, in order to understand the effects of these things in the individual's life. So very often in the case of applied behavior analysis, think of punishment as a possible procedure to use to intervene. But it's very important to keep in mind that punishment is something that happens very often in our lives all day long. Go outside without an umbrella now, and aversive events will occur. Happens in all of our lives. And so even if you're working with people with developmental disabilities, autism and so forth, it's very important to have a clear understanding of the effects of punishment on our behavior. And what I'm going to talk about today is the definition of punishment. There are two rival definitions of punishment in the history of behavior analysis, and I want to compare those two and suggest to you that the one that you're probably using now is not the best. The one that that most people learn in the applied behavior analysis textbooks, I think is not ideally suited for clinical work. And if you limit your understanding of punishment to that definition, I think it inhibits clinical practice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe those two different interpretations, descriptions of the effects of punishment. Of course, our principles and our descriptions are just conditional stimuli that interact with other stimuli, guiding our behavior, guiding how we make our treatment plans, and how we understand the relation between the individual's behavior and his or her circumstances before they come to the laboratory. And it's good to think about the conditions under which and the effects of our terminology on our analytic behavior. So this is, by the way, this is the original punishment. This is Adam and Eve have misbehaved. They have violated a rule, and the consequence of that violation is both positive punishment, because the archangel is hitting them with a sword there, and it's also negative punishment because they were enjoying pineapples and bananas and all of the fruits in the world, but they were not supposed to eat the apple. Tasted the apple, and now they're losing paradise. So they were enjoying a positive reinforcer that's now terminated, and they're also now experiencing a negative reinforcer, the painful push from a sword that did not occur before the behavior. So the behavior had two effects: lost a positive reinforcer, gained a negative reinforcer, a double punishment. And how do we walk? Okay, so I need
Maybe
this.
no, it didn't work.
Okay, cool.
Maybe just next.
Okay. So, what's happened in the history of understanding punishment is that we've had two different definitions. In the one definition, punishment is an operation, and in the other definition, punishment is considered a process. So first, let's distinguish between what we mean by operation and process. So the term operation describes the arrangement of a relation between behavior and other events in space and time, whether or not it occurs in accordance with plans. So it describes the relationship between behavior and circumstance, but not the effect of those circumstances on behavior. This is what we do when we plan, for example, a reinforcement operation. We arrange circumstances so that the behavior will have a certain effect, but that independent of the effect. Other examples, deprivation is an operation. In deprivation, we're withholding food, or of course, all of these operations also occur in everyday life anyway. So if it's been a long time since we've had a meal, then food as a stimulus, the reinforcing property of food changes. Where it's more likely to be effective in both in reinforcing our behavior and, of course, discriminative stimuli that says this is a good place to get food acquire reinforcing potency as well. So we'll go to a place and we'll order some food under these circumstances. So, but that's just the process. The process is the fact that there has been an extended period of time without consumption of food. That's the operation. That's the operation. The operation of stimulus pairing also. So if we have an aversive a stimulus that elicits fear, for example, and fear is then elicited in the presence of a particular person. So a person comes in the room and starts yelling. The very intense voice elicits fear, and elicits fear in the presence of that person's face, in the presence of that person's behavior. So that's pairing of stimuli. There was an aversive event that's now paired with the characteristics of the teacher, the characteristics of the person that enters the room, independent of its effects on our emotion. So that's just the operation that occurs at this point in time. So in an operation, no effect of the arrangement between behavior and environment is specified. So operations are described in precision in the methods section of experimental reports and in treatment and lesson plans of applied behavior analysts. But they're actually ubiquitous. I mean, we're doing that when we're planning an experiment. We're arranging behavior environmental circumstances. And also when we're making a treatment plan, we're also engaging in activity and then arranging circumstances in the hope of changing behavior. But the operation is just the arrangement of circumstances without taking into account the effect of that event. Process describes the operation and its effect. So the word process includes the arrangement of behavior environmental circumstances, and it includes the effect of those behavior environmental arrangements on the individual's behavior. So for example, when we speak about a motivational process, we're speaking about deprivation of food, for example, and the increased reinforcing potency of food. And the presence of food-seeking behavior under those circumstances. So one thing is the arrangement of the circumstances, right? That it's been a long time since food, and another thing is the effects of that arrangement of circumstances on the behavior of the individual. That's a process. So process is a more comprehensive term. It includes the arrangement of behavior environment circumstances, plus the effect of that on behavior. So when we speak about a motivational process, we're talking about, for example, the deprivation of food that increases the reinforcing potency of food as a reinforcing stimulus. When we talk about the process of Pavlovian conditioning, of respondent conditioning, we're talking about not only the pairing of a neutral and an eliciting stimulus, but also the changes in behavior that occur, the acquisition of a conditional reflex, the acquisition of a conditional reflex. So processes are described in precision in the introduction, in the results, and in the discussion section of experimental articles. So you're doing the experiment to understand better processes. But in order to see the effect of the environment, you have to arrange those processes that are described in the methods section. And then the results of those processes and your interpretation of those results is all discussion about process. Is the distinction between operation and process clear enough? Question. Is reinforcement a process? What do you say? Is reinforcement a process? It's not a trick question. Of course it's a process. It's the process. It's our most important phenomenon. If we're going to be able to help people, if we're going to be able to change the world, we have to know a lot about this process. It's a process because it describes a relation between behavior and other events and the effect of that operation, and the effect of that operation on our behavior. So reinforcement does not occur unless the arrangement of a consequence for behavior, or at least something that follows upon the behavior, increases the subsequent probability of emission of behaviors of that form, of acts of that form. So it's a process. It includes both the arrangement of the circumstances, a consequential operation, and the effect of that operation, an increase in the frequency of the behavior. So, for example, when somebody says to us, I tried reinforcement and it didn't work, you didn't try reinforcement. You had a reinforcement operation, what you suspected to be a reinforcing operation, but it didn't work. It didn't change behavior. So you had an operation, but not a process. You had a reinforcing operation, but not a reinforcing process. Clear? What events are called reinforcement in practice? Often used to describe the relationship of a condition in practice. Okay? Very often we say, I'm going to reinforce this behavior as a shorthand. We will reinforce eye contact. We will reinforce playing with other children. We will reinforce these sorts of events. That's the way that we talk about it. But of course, what we mean about that is we will arrange a reinforcing contingency. We will arrange a contingency that we suspect will produce an increase in the emission probability of the targeted behavior. But of course, we don't know that it's going to be effective until we try it. So it's not actually reinforcement until we have seen the effect of that behavior. But we use the term in two ways. We use the term to describe the operation, and we also use the term to describe the process. But very basically, the cornerstone principle of our science is that it's a process, that it changes behavior, and it does not occur until it changes behavior. So in practice, we use the term reinforcement as to describe operations, and we use it to describe processes. But basically, it's a process. I mean, process. I say that Americanica. It's a process. Okay. We use it to describe an operation in the hope that it will induce, in the expectation that it will induce a favorable outcome. It implies an anticipated process when we use it operationally, when we use it to describe what we're going to do to change behavior. With me? Cool. What events are called punishment? Well, probably you have learned, if you learned behavior analysis from applied behavior analysis textbooks, most of them describe operation in a way that as Reinholz defined it in the 60s. Punishment has occurred when a response is followed immediately by a stimulus change that decreases the future frequency of similar responses. So this definition of punishment is symmetrical to the definition of reinforcement. It includes both the operation of arranging of circumstances as a consequence of behavior and an effect of that operation, a reduction in the emission frequency of responses of acts of that form. What's implied in this principle, because a principle means that it's not useful to reduce it further. A first principle means, it doesn't mean that we can't reduce it further, because of course in the end, behavior analysis is physics. I mean, it's about the movements of molecules, but you know, it's going to be a long time until even a molecular analysis arrives at that point. We can always, of course, reduce the phenomenon there further. But it's not, when we describe a statement as a first principle, that means that for our task, it's not useful to reduce it further. A first principle means, of course, we can understand reinforcement from a neurobiological perspective, you know, from at different levels of analysis. But for us, we take it as a first principle. In other words, we don't ask, well, you know, what is that reinforcement made out of? So this claim, this definition of punishment, is a claim that the phenomenon of punishment is also, it's not beneficial to further reduce it. We can just take it as a given that the effect of these events is a reduction in the frequency of that behavior, and that's what we call punishment, symmetrical to the principle of reinforcement. And so the claim is, implicitly, that punishment demands its own principle, that punishment demands a first principle equivalent to the principle of reinforcement, and in fact symmetrically opposite to the principle of reinforcement. It's as a consequence of behavior, the emission frequency of that behavior is reduced. Okay, and I'm going to challenge that. Because the other definition of punishment that does not tend to appear now in applied behavior analysis textbooks, it's not my definition. It was actually the definition of B.F. Skinner, of Nate Schoenfeld. It's described very clearly in what is still for me the best introductory textbook of all, better than my own, Keller and Schoenfeld. And also other behavior analysts like Murray Sidman, James Dinsmoor. This was their understanding. This was their description of punishment, because they were very interested in understanding processes that are involved when punishment occurs. They went for this kind of definition. So their definition is that punishment is just an operation. It's limited to an operation. Punishment has occurred when an act of a given form precedes a negative reinforcer, or the termination of a positive reinforcer. Whether that was produced by the behavior or not, because we have the phenomenon of adventitious punishment. Bad things occur right after behavior without being produced by those behaviors, but it's strictly an operation. It describes a behavior-environment relation without describing the effect of that behavior-environment relation on the behavior of the individual. Why? Because it was their view from experimental analysis that the effects of punishment are multiple and complex. That it's not if we don't take into account those various effects of punishment, then we will have a less complete, a less useful analysis of the phenomenon. And I think, and this will be the second point of the presentation that I'm going to make today after we discuss the definition of punishment. I think that without taking into account all of those multiple effects of punishment, that we're just hamstrung in clinical behavior analysis, because clinical behavior analysis is basically treatment of the effects of punishment, principally social punishment, but in general, bad things that have happened over long periods of time to individuals, and we'll discuss that in the second half of the talk today. Now, you can keep your definition, if you like, in many cases, but then you just have to think also about these other processes that are involved in punishment. The good thing about the Skinnerian definition of punishment is that it requires you, it's a prompt for further analysis. It tells you, in order to understand what's going on here when it changes behavior, that you're going to have to think about multiple things. And there are at least 4 of those things that we're going to talk about today that one has to think about. So this definition is a prompt for further analysis. The definition of Asrin says, okay, if you see an event that occurs subsequent to the emission of a behavior, and that behavior decreases in frequency, you're done. That's a first principle. You move on to further understanding. The Skinnerian Sidman Schoenfeld definition says your job is just started. So when you see this kind of behavior-environment relation, then you have to analyze other things that are going on, and particularly both respondent and operant processes that are occurring in the life of the individual whose behavior is being punished. So there is a corresponding asymmetry, because this is we're talking about an asymmetry in the definition of reinforcement and punishment. Okay, reinforcement is operationally defined. Reinforcement is functionally defined, and punishment is only operationally defined. And we do have a corresponding distinction that we make in the vernacular. When we say that we are reinforcing behavior as an operation, what we mean is that we're strengthening that behavior as a process. So reinforcement, the reinforcement is a metaphorical term, of course, from mechanics. It means strengthening. So reinforcement strengthens behavior. But in the vernacular, punishment as an operation, it does not imply weakening as a process. It does not imply a reduction in the frequency of behavior, because it's very often the case that we arrange a punishment contingency that doesn't work, that does not change behavior. So according to the definition of punishment that you've been learning in applied behavior analysis textbooks, if a person goes to jail for 2 years as a consequence of a crime, and then comes out of jail, and commits that crime again, then the behavior hasn't been punished. But from the Skinnerian point of view, the behavior has been punished because it's an operation, but the operation was not effective. So we need to understand what's going on in this situation. The punishment operation was not effective in changing behavior, and then we have to think about why that's going on. Is that clear? That's going to be important for us a little bit later, because psychopathology, by definition, survives punishment. And if we accept the given definition of punishment, that means that punishment is not occurring, which makes it hard to talk about these kinds of events, I think. So, in summary, this is the slide that all of us learned the noun and the adjective for these different kinds of circumstances. On this axis, the reinforcer is either a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer based upon something that we already know about the behavior of the individual. And the behavior either produces a negative reinforcer or a positive reinforcer, or it terminates a negative reinforcer or a positive reinforcer. Okay. So this term is used to describe basically a process, but also as a shorthand, we use it to describe an operation as well. But in the Skinnerian position, this is just an operation. This is limited to an operation. Of course, we're going to study the effects of it, but because it has multiple effects, and multiple effects is directly implied by the fact that there is an asymmetry also in the conditions in which we punish behavior and reinforce behavior. Because punishment always occurs in a context of reinforcement. Because if there was not reinforcement, there would be no behavior to punish. I mean, that's true socially. I mean, if there's a problematic behavior that's occurring, it's occurring for a reason. If it's an operant behavior, that reason is the consequences of those behaviors. So when we're introducing a punishment contingency, we are introducing it in the context of an already functional relation. So it's a second event that's introduced into a functional relation. That's not true. It's literally true, but it's effectively not true about punishment contingencies. About reinforcement contingencies, about positive reinforcement contingencies. Because in a positive reinforcement contingency, it's not necessarily the case that behavior is being punished and now we're going to reinforce it. The behavior might not even be occurring at all, a zero frequency of occurrence of a behavior of a particular form, and then we're arranging consequences of behavior that are already emitted as a way of generating material for shaping for behavior, for the differentiation of behavior. So punishment always occurs in a context of substantial reinforcement for the punished behavior. But punishment always occurs in a context of substantial reinforcement for the punished behavior. Yes, correctly I said it. But that's not true of reinforcement. When we reinforce a behavior, it's not necessarily being punished. When we punish a behavior, it's necessarily being reinforced. So it's already a more complex case. And that complexity deepens the further we go into the study of it. Are you with me until the moment? Cool. Okay. If punishment is not a process, then what are the processes involved when punishment operations reduce the emission frequency of the punished form of action? Punishment doesn't always work in the Skinnerian definition. So although it's illegitimate to say I tried reinforcement and reinforcement didn't work, in the Skinnerian definition, it's completely legitimate to say I tried punishment, because that's an operation, and that operation had no discernible effect on behavior, on the punished behavior. Because as we'll see, that punishment operation probably has effects on other behaviors as well, but no effect on the punished behavior. There are two classes of effects, 4 effects altogether, 2 classes of effects. One is the effects on respondent behavior, because the loss of something valuable or the presentation of something horrible is not hedonically neutral. And it does not only have effects on the act that produced that event, it also elicits behavior itself. It also elicits behavior as conditional or unconditional eliciting stimulus. And this is an experimental demonstration of this from Russell Church's laboratory. These are, the subjects are rats exposed to a condition that occurs very often in everyday life. The same form of behavior is at some points reinforced positively and at some points punished positively. So if you're going out to meet a friend, then your behavior is positively reinforced by the events that occur as you walk towards that friend. But if it's raining really hard and you have forgotten an umbrella, then that behavior is also positively and the rain is cold. I mean, it's not like a romantic, summertime rain by the beach or something. I mean, rain, pouring down rain, then that same behavior is bringing you in contact with a negative reinforcer. So the same behavior is at the same time, or in this case, at different points in time, but in the same period, both reinforced and punished. So this is lever pressing in a rat that is reinforced by we have made a motivational operation. We've deprived the animal of food for a period of time. It's hungry. And we arrange a positive reinforcing contingency for that behavior, again, an operation, which increases the probability of emission of pressing the lever. And that goes on for 30 days. Every day, the rat goes into his job, sits down at his desk, works around for a while, and makes his living in this way for 30 days. After 30 days, there's a change in administration. and this same behavior, in the case of these animals here, this same behavior is also punished. So it's reinforced, but also punished. Sometimes it brings a lovely piece of food. Sometimes the same act brings an electric shock to the feet. This shock is not enough to do any tissue damage to the individual. It's something approximating what's happening now at this time of year when we walk on a carpet and press and touch something, we get a static electricity shock from that. But it surprises the organism. It surprises the organism and is known to work as a negative reinforcer. In other words, if we gave the animal a way to terminate those events, the animal would do so. So operationally, it's punishment, the production of a negative reinforcer as a consequence of behavior. And then this is actually group design, but you could just think about this. The data are very consistent between individuals, so you could just think about this as 3 different rats in this situation. So this is what we're looking at here is the proportion of baseline rate, the percent of baseline rate that we get when we've introduced this new condition of the experiment. So this is after a baseline period. This is a manipulation phase, and the manipulation is different in our 3 different subjects here. Okay, so and this is across sessions. Here is this across sessions, and what we see here is a precipitous decrease by the second session. Session in the frequency of occurrence of this behavior. So the punishment is effective. It has reduced the frequency of emission of this behavior, both by an operational definition and by a process definition. We have decreased the frequency of this behavior. These animals, and we can compare that effect with this animal in this condition, that the proportion of baseline rate is not decreased at all, because nothing's changed. For this individual, it's still got a really good job. It was making food, pressing the lever. It's still making food, pressing the lever. Nobody's yelling at them. Nobody's threatening them. No horrible things are happening to this individual. So there's no change in the individual's behavior. We would not expect a change because there's no new operation that's occurring here. What's interesting about the experiment is the third group. This group here received shock at exactly the same rate as this group. So it's a yoked control condition. So at every point that one rat in the punishment group received a shock, then a rat in the group that's in this group also receives a shock, but not as a consequence of bar pressing. So they're receiving the same number of shocks. They're receiving it at the same rate as other individuals in the experiment, but the shocks are occurring. The computer programs the shock to never follow a lever press. So they're exposed to aversive stimuli without the aversive stimuli to be a consequence of behavior. Okay, and what we see here is a substantial reduction in the frequency of pressing the lever, despite the fact that the behavior is not operationally punished. Operation means that the behavior is occurring, that the event is occurring as a consequence of behavior. So what this tells us is that when punishment occurs, when we have a punishment procedure introduced, that there are respondent effects. Because all of this, our analysis of punishment from a Skinnerian perspective, is based on what Skinner calls the economy of behavior. we cannot engage in all behaviors at the same time. We cannot fill out our tax returns and watch a football game and play with our kids and go for a walk in the park at the same time. To the extent that we're doing one thing, we cannot do other things because it takes up processing capacity, resources of the organism. And that's to some degree true about the operant-respondent interaction. Because if you've ever tried to give a talk or something when you're like really, really afraid, well, it's more hard to do than if you were quite relaxed under those circumstances. You can do it, but the respondent behavior and operant behavior tend to be, to some degree, incompatible. So to the extent that intense sympathetic arousal is being elicited, it's more difficult to engage in problem solving, in other kinds of activities, or even doing your job. So one of the reasons why punishment contingencies reduce the frequency of behavior has nothing to do with punishment. It's a respondent effect. These things are dropping into the situation, and that's one of the reasons why when somebody comes into a classroom very aggressively, teacher comes into a classroom very aggressively and yells at everybody, and everybody has to be really careful in this situation. That will reduce the frequency of behaviors that the person doesn't want to see in the class. They will be acting up less. There will be lower frequency, in part due to the fact that because if he's managed to scare everybody, that the intense sympathetic arousal is to some degree incompatible with coming up with a good joke or a trick to do in the class. Unfortunately, it's also incompatible with arithmetic, with thinking about history. It's also incompatible with the behaviors that we want to generate in the class, which is one of the reasons why we do not recommend punishment as an educational tool, because it elicits behavior that is to some degree incompatible with the emission of the kinds of behaviors that we want to produce. So this is of course exposure to an unconditional eliciting stimulus, but when we're actually punishing behavior, we're also setting up a perfect condition for respondent conditioning, because not all behaviors are punished. The punished form of behavior produces stimuli. All of the time when we're behaving, we're producing stimuli. Somatosensory, proprioceptive stimuli, but also stimuli produced by our movements through the environment. And the stimuli that are produced by behavior that are unique to the punished behavior are then paired with the aversive event. And so there's an arrangement of a Pavlovian pairing procedure between the stimuli produced by the punished behavior and the stimuli and the punishing stimulus, the punishing event. Even if it's negative punishment, this is still produces sympathetic arousal. So what we're doing when we're arranging a punishing contingency is also arranging a Pavlovian contingency between the stimuli produced by the punished response and the aversive stimulus, the aversive event that we're pairing basically with that event. It's not necessary for us to do the pairing. The pairing naturally occurs because you're behaving, that behavior produces stimuli, and that behavior is punished. And the punisher is also an eliciting stimulus for sympathetic arousal. And so that effect passes on to the stimulus that immediately occurred before that event, which is the stimuli produced by that behavior. Okay, so what we're doing is not only scaring the kids, which reduces all kinds of operant behavior, but we're also specifically making them scared when they start to do something that has been punished in the past. The stimuli produced automatically in the behavior by the behavior of the same individual is going to elicit fear, which disrupts disruption, but it also disrupts production of academic activity that we want to see. So, the effects of punishment on respondent behavior include elicitation of emotional respondent behavior somewhat incompatible with the punished act, as well as other acts, unfortunately. Acquisition of conditional eliciting potency by stimuli produced by the punished act. Murray Sidman called these warning signals for punishment. So then the stimuli produced by my own behavior will elicit fear, and as we'll see in a bit, will work also as discriminative stimuli for escape. This last one we'll talk about in just a little while. An additional respondent effect is when you have terminated a threatening event. That's not a hedonically neutral occurrence. So you're making your application for graduate school, and maybe suddenly you realize you forgot to put an important paper in there, and then, you saved yourself at the last minute, you checked it and saved yourself at the last minute. Oof! Redemption, catharsis, safety, however we might describe it, it's an hedonically intense experience. And of course, also when we're checking to see if we did it right, or when we're engaging in a behavior that any behavior that terminates a threat, that behavior is also producing stimuli, and those stimuli get paired with an event that elicits redemption, safety, how we can say it, relief in the situation that we're in, and that establishes another conditional reflex. Another conditional reflex, because the stimuli, when I do something that has got me out of trouble in the past, it's going to relax me. It's going to make me feel cool. So if in the past, I left the kitchen stove on and then returned and people started yelling at me, or I can start imagining that I could have burned the house down. Then the next time I leave the house, without checking the stove, that's going to elicit some degree of fear. And then the act of returning there and seeing that the stove is off is going to elicit relaxation, safety, and so forth. And as we'll see, that also establishes the positive reinforcement potency of those events. We see already how complex the effects of punishment might be. But especially important for us is going to be the effects of punishment on operant behavior. It's important for us to forestall mishap resulting from our own actions. We get ourselves into trouble all the time, and it's a good idea to avoid it. That's true both evolutionarily, and it's true both in ontogeny and in our own lives. So we start with that. It's important to not screw up. It's important to not damage ourselves, damage other people, and so forth. And that means that lots of our activities are punished. Lots of our activities produce events that if we could terminate those events, we would do so. All of our activities produce stimuli. The stimuli uniquely produced by the punished response, as I said before, are paired with a punitive event, are paired with an event that elicits fear, dropey, shame, all kinds of bad feelings that we have. It's all sympathetic arousal, but we call it different names in different situations. And these stimuli acquire negative reinforcing potency. So when I do something and that activity is punished, the stimuli produced by that activity unavoidably are paired with an event that elicits fear, and that's how we require. That's how the stimuli produced by our own behavior acquire negative reinforcing potency, by being paired with aversive events, events that function aversively for us. It also produces discriminative control by those same events. So you suddenly think, I've left the stove on, and that event produces fear, but it also evokes the emission of behaviors that have terminated that aversive event in the past, returning home and turning off the stove. In fact, that's a whole chain of behavior that's evoked in that case. So what happens in punishment is, if it works, right? If it works, what's happening is that the stimuli produced by the punished behavior are being paired with events that make them eliciting stimuli for fear, and at the same time they become eliciting stimuli for fear, we are acting. And if one of our actions in the presence of that self-produced eliciting stimulus for fear terminates it, then that behavior is going to be reinforced. So what? Many times in clinical case studies we say, well, this is a really problematic behavior. We've tried to work on it for a long period of time. Let's think about maybe using a punishment contingency in this case, because we're not getting anywhere at this point in time. So are we going to punish the behavior that we don't want to see, or are we going to reinforce the behavior that we do want to see in this situation, an incompatible behavior? So the decision that we make, whether to punish or whether to reinforce, is really a decision about whether we're going to positively reinforce or negatively reinforce. Because in essence, the punishment procedure is a motivational operation, drive operation. Drive operation is any operation that changes the reinforcing potency of an event. And what this does is changes the reinforcing potency of events that were neutral, that are produced by our own behavior. They make the events that are paired with punishment operate as negative reinforcers, so that when I engage in that behavior again, it's going to increase the probability of omission of that behavior. And just an example from one of my students. She had a job with her family out in a field, a question of inheritance and who's going to take this property and so forth. So it's a big family situation. It's an intense situation. They're doing a lot of discussion, and she has her small, my student has her small niece with her. But everybody's having this big discussion, and the niece goes off playing by herself. Well, in this field, there's a big garbage pile in the middle of it because nobody's using this field. And in the garbage pile is an old ball, a colorful ball, a toy. Nobody's paying attention to the kid. She doesn't have anything to do in this situation. She wanders over to this trash pile, and she leans down to pick, she sees this ball and leans down to pick up the ball. Well, my student sees all of this and yells at her, "No, no!" The no elicits fear, because she says it very intensely, and also the word no has also a history of pairing with other aversive events. And it scares her. And what does she do in this situation? She does what she's done in the situation in the past when they say no. She stops doing it. So she engages in a behavior that's incompatible with picking up the ball. What behavior is incompatible with picking up the ball? Standing up straight. So she stands up straight. The incident is over. Everybody goes back to their discussion. After a little while, she goes again to the ball. No! The same behavior on her part from her previous history of what to do when they say no. What we do when we say no is whatever we're doing, we stop doing it. Terminating the stimuli that are produced by that behavior. After a little while, she sees her again to lean in towards the ball, and suddenly she stops by herself. Nobody said no. Nobody frightened her, but she looks frightened. What was the stimulus that frightened her? The interpretation, we don't know. The interpretation was that that was the stimuli that were automatically produced by that behavior. So they elicit fear, and also standing up in this case is not a elicited behavior. It's an act. It's an operant behavior. So as an SD, this bad self-produced event evoked the emission of an incompatible form of behavior, and that was reinforced by the termination of the self-produced aversive stimuli. Reinforced by the termination of the self-produced aversive stimuli. So all of this is now going on within the organism. The organism is playing around doing stuff. The activities produce stimuli. Those activities are punished. That establishes the negative reinforcing potency and eliciting potency for fear, shame, so forth of that event. So that when I do it again, and I produce those stimuli again, they'll have a different effect on my behavior. They'll elicit fear, shame, other intense sympathetic arousal, and also as an SD, because this is not my first time in this situation, not my first bad rodeo. In this situation, it's going to evoke behavior that has terminated these kinds of events in the past. It's just now starting to get cold in Athens, and the same thing happens to me every year, because in my kitchen there's a radiator, and this radiator, lots of discussions occur in my kitchen and so forth. This radiator is a really good place to lean on, and you can put a beer on it, and so all summer long, I'm leaning on this, I'm talking and so forth, and now it's cold again, it's starting to get cold again, so we start putting the heat on. So what happens to me is, I'm having this discussion, I'm having my beer, I lean on the radiator, and it burns me because now it's hot. So when this happens, of course, it's going to elicit a withdrawal response immediately, and the stimuli of reaching towards the radiator produced those events. So when I do that again, I'm reproducing the same stimuli that have been paired with intense heat in the past. So I usually have to do this 2 or 3 times because I'm not a fast learner. But eventually what happens is that I will start to put my hand there. The incipient behavior produces stimuli that have been paired with aversive events in the past. And suddenly, I'm a little bit shocked by what I've done, and then I withdraw from that event. That's operant behavior, and I might even keep my distance from those events so that I'm not tempted, because this radiator is evoking behavior that's no longer adaptive. I'm going to burn myself if I keep doing this. I might even keep my distance from this sort of event. Putting the devil behind me, so to speak, putting distance between myself and the temptation to engage in an activity that has been punished. So now my own behavior, because the radiator's been there the whole time, my own behavior produces events that elicit fear and that evoke as SD actions that have terminated those events in the past. Are you with me? This is just a diagrammatic example that comes from my own experience as a grade school student with the Sisters of Mercy. As I rose from my seat, something that very often happened, and now I suppose people don't do that, is I would get a smack in the back of the head and go or yell, "Mellon again, you're out of your seat, what's going on here?" Or some other undesirable sort of event. So I got up out of my seat, bam, an aversive event occurs. When that occurs, the rising from the seat, of course, produces unique stimuli. Stimuli that are different from staying in my seat or from dancing the ciftatelli or any other form of behavior. And these particular events produced by my behavior are now paired with a smack in the head, which elicits fear. And so what happens is that the stimuli produced automatically from rising from my seat have been paired with an event that produces arousal, tension, fear. And now, when again a little while later I get up out of my seat, now I'm like my student in the field, I'm scared, and so my own behavior has frightened me, or the stimuli produced by my own behavior have frightened me. And what I do in this situation, maybe I don't know what to do in this situation, but my teacher will tell me, "Sit down, Mellon," and I sit down, and then she goes on with the lesson. So she's terminated all of the threats as a consequence of my operant behavior. And so then these behaviors, which are warning signals for punishment, right? Then evoke the second time when I engage in this behavior again. The teacher doesn't have to tell me, "Mellon, sit down." After the third time maybe, I sit down by myself, terminating then the stimuli produced by my own behavior. So this is what other essentialistic forms of psychology call the internalization of social rules. But I didn't eat any social rule here. I was interacting with the environment, and that's changing the effects of stimuli produced by my own behavior on my own subsequent behavior. Okay? And then what happens? I sit down, and sitting down also produces unique stimuli. And these stimuli get paired with the termination of the shock. Because she didn't catch me, right? I was getting up, and then I sat back down again. Woof! The sister didn't even see me get up. So I'm relieved from the fact that I have terminated my own self-produced aversive stimulus, and then my behavior is negatively reinforced by the termination of the threat that I produced, the threat to myself that I produced. And because that behavior also produces stimuli, the stimuli produced by the behavior that is permitted, the behavior, if Adam had put down the apple and picked up a banana, he would have been fine. So the stimuli produced by the behavior that got me out of the difficult situation also produce stimuli, and those stimuli are paired with relief from shock, termination from shock. And that's also a hedonically significant event. Recent biomedical physiological research has shown that the termination of an aversive event produces a dopamine rush in the brain, much like the dopamine rush produced by a very intensively strong positive reinforcer. So it's a relief It's a pleasure, catharsis, redemption, safety. We have various different terms for the kind of thing that we're feeling at this point in time. But now that feeling is produced by our own behavior. And those stimuli, events that are paired with pleasurable events that we describe as pleasurable, that work as positive reinforcers, tend to acquire positive reinforcing potency. And what that means in this situation is that the stimuli produced by the behavior that have terminated punishment now have positive reinforcing potency. And that's the fourth effect of punishment. First effect, as an unconditional stimulus or already present conditional eliciting stimulus, it elicits behavior that is to some degree incompatible with the subsequent emission of the punished response form. Second, it establishes the conditional eliciting potency of the stimuli automatically produced in the emission of the punished behavior, because those stimuli are uniquely paired with the punishing event, which also elicits arousal. So then when I again reproduce those events, the stimuli produced by my own behavior will frighten me, will make me feel ashamed, whatever, will make me feel sick, disgust, whatever the effect of the event was on my behavior will now be transferred to my own behavior. Okay, and that's also going to reduce will tend to reduce the frequency of emission of the problematic form of behavior. But the real killer is the negative reinforcing effect of those same sorts of events, because the subsequent emission of those events will produce behaviors that surprise me, shock me, because they've been paired with punishment, and then changing my game, doing something else, will automatically eliminate those behaviors. And in very, very close temporal contiguity, exactly what we need in order to be effective reinforcing event. So punishment arranges for negative reinforcing contingencies for the punished behavior. And then when those negative reinforcing contingencies are effective, when I'm effectively escaping from my self-produced threats, then under those circumstances, the stimuli produced by the escape behavior, the stimuli produced by whatever act got me out of that difficult situation in which I was in, are going to start working as positive reinforcers. Which means that I don't even have to be afraid in order for those events, as a consequence of my behavior, to affect the subsequent probability of emission of that behavior. Of course, I'll do it more when there is a threat, when there is a self-produced threat, but those events will be reinforcing even in the absence of any threat. Positive reinforcer means that in the absence of that event, the behavior that produces it will increase in probability. So in the absence of any particular threat, then those events are going to have positive reinforcing potency. You know, the distinction between positive and negative reinforcers is really more semantic than real, because all reinforcing events are transitions from one state to another. So positive reinforcement is the termination of a state in which you didn't have that positive reinforcer, and negative reinforcement is the production of a state in the absence of those events. But it's a very useful semantic distinction to make. You know, some behavior analysts have said we need to get rid of the terminology of negative and positive reinforcement. I don't think so. I think it's very useful, because just in order to get closer contact with how we think about things in daily life. So, for example, if we're walking in the woods, you know, and I get a thorn in my eye, you know, I'm not going to ask you at that point in time, could you create a thorn-free environment for my eye? No, I'm going to say, get the thorn out of my eye. You know, so the way in which we describe the event as the termination of a negative reinforcer or the production of a positive reinforcer is really more semantic than actual. It's a useful distinction, but it breaks down in these kinds of cases. So it's much better to talk about the transition from a threatening environment to a safe environment. Because what our data show is that it's very important to pay attention to events that are occurring before the emission of the escape behavior and in events that occur after the escape behavior. So if you make the escape more salient, for example, then the stimuli produced by that escape are going to be more powerful positive reinforcing events. We need to pay attention to events that are occurring on both sides of the escape behavior. The termination of self-produced stimuli and the production of self-produced stimuli, which will have different effects on behavior. But basically the whole thing is a transition from a state of threat to a state of non-threat. That's the basic point, if you're with me. Yeah? Is there something that I can clarify at this point in time? Are you getting a feel for the complexity of events that are involved in the in punishment contingencies? Yeah. Okay. Let's think about what happens in so-called discrete trial punishment versus so-called Sidman avoidance or free operant avoidance or unsignaled avoidance. Those are all three synonyms. In a signal or discrete trial avoidance, a warning signal precedes the aversive event, and an action taken during the signal terminates the signal and cancels the otherwise scheduled presentation of an aversive event. So if we have a rat in a conditioning chamber, a red light might come on, and if there's no activity produced by the organism under those circumstances, if it doesn't press a lever, for example, then the organism will receive a shock, a negative reinforcing, eliciting stimuli for fear. But if the individual, so he's in there for a good period of time, the red light comes on, and then there's a shock. So what we have to do under these situations is we have to shape the behavior of pressing the bar in the presence of the red light. And we do that, first of all, by establishing the red light as a conditional aversive stimulus, and then we turn off the red light when the rat looks toward the red light. And approaches the red light is behind the lever, and gradually we use the termination of the light as a reinforcer for approaching the lever, for raising up, for pressing the lever, and so forth. So we're shaping behavior by negative reinforcement, which it follows exactly the same procedures as shaping behavior by positive reinforcement. Of course, we can shape behavior by negative reinforcement as well. So what happens in this situation then is that the warning signal works as an SD. It has two functions at the same time. It's a negative reinforcer, but it's also an SD. It threatens you, but it also tells you what you have to do to terminate the threat, and by the way, also to terminate the event that otherwise would be scheduled to occur. So the reinforcer in this situation, which is a strange situation because the animal can go for days in this situation without ever receiving a shock. So what's controlling the behavior? It's not the punishment, because the punishment is not occurring for long periods of time, and it's not even the shock anyway, because the bar press doesn't even terminate the shock immediately. It terminates the next presentation of the shock. So the reinforcer is actually the termination of the warning signal for shock. So from Sidman's position, there is no operationally. There's no in terms of a process, there is no avoidance. Avoidance is not a process. Avoidance is what we call the process is escape. So avoidance is escape from warning signals for punishment. If I'm terminating an event that never occurs, because how can the termination of an event that never occurs affect my behavior? How can nothing affect my behavior? And any cancellation of event is also a future event. Of course, we know that future events cannot affect anything at all because they're not events. They're just predictions of events. So this behavior is actually reinforced in the Sidman position by the termination of the warning signal. So the warning signal becomes a conditional negative reinforcer, and the avoidant behavior is maintained by the termination of this signal. So the stimuli uniquely produced by the punish response form are paired with a punitive event, acquire negative reinforcing potency, and also discriminative control over the actions that terminate them. They evoke escape from self-produced warning signals for punishment. Punishment arranges the negative reinforcement of behavior incompatible with the punished action. So our choice in making a treatment procedure is we're going to either positively reinforce incompatible behavior, or negatively reinforce incompatible behavior. That's our choice. The choice between punishment and reinforcement is a choice between negative and positive reinforcement. In the what happens at that point in time? Don't pay any attention to this slide. What happens at that point in time is that we gradually fade out the warning signal. So the red light gradually disappears, and the situation still continues until we have completely eliminated the warning signal for punishment. And a rat under this situation and pigeons in our laboratory work for a long period of time with no warning signal for punishment given by the experiment. When you look at their behavior, you say, what is reinforcing this behavior? We see them engaging in a long period of time. We see nothing to support this kind of behavior because the events that have established it are no longer, the events that are establishing the shock are no longer occurring, but there is still a negative reinforcing contingency in effect. It's just a self-produced warning signal for punishment. So in Sidman's interpretation, free operant avoidance is not free at all. It's a discrete trial procedure, but just the discriminative stimulus is produced by the organism instead of by the experiment. So this interpretation is a way of understanding. This interpretation actually preceded Sidman's isolation of so-called free operant avoidance or Sidman avoidance in the laboratory, but it provides an explanation for why avoidance appears to occur in the absence of threat. There is threat. It's just threats that are typically unobservable because they are not publicly observable. They are produced by the organism's own behavior. But of course, from a behavior analytic perspective, the environment doesn't start at the individual skin. The environment is anywhere events occur that can alter our behavior. Of course, we can only interpret in general these sorts of events, but interpretation is what science is all about. Oops. So, the free operant or Sidman or unsignaled avoidance procedure appears to provide no current aversive event, no warning signal. When no one else warns us, we warn ourselves. We ourselves produce the aversive stimuli that evoke escape by the initial or inchoate emission of the punished response form. Now, because I'm short on time, I'm just going to go without any more slides. I have slides for all of these things that I'll tell you. But this, are you with me until this point in time? Yeah. Oh, I got to go right here. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for the prompt. Not aversive at all. Okay. This gives us a way of opening up clinical phenomena that otherwise, first of all, behavior analysts are not very well represented in clinical psychology. There's a slide. I'll show you this slide anyway. This I have to tell you. One thing I have to tell you. In the textbooks, often when they describe punishment as a procedure, which I don't recommend under any case, they have what they call side effects of punishment. Side effects. So the main effect of punishment is to reduce the frequency, the emission frequency of the punished behavior. But they have what are called side effects. For example, sometimes when we punish the behavior, the person becomes very emotional. They start to cry, or they detach themselves from us, or look the other way, or look very, very sad. These are all behaviors that are engaged in that have respondent components, but also can come under the control of that, because if somebody looks very sad, and then you say, okay, sorry, you don't have to do that. So I say, put your shoes on, we're going to go to grandma's house. Okay, we'll go later, or I'll call her on the phone. We terminate those sorts of events and reinforce those sorts of behaviors. The person could tantrum. Big people and small people do it as well. No, I'm very angry at this situation. They could be aggressive. So when we punish the behavior, they might bite us. They might call us names. They might return the aggression, what's called counter-aggressive control to us. They could also just bust a move, get out of there, leave you, run away, terminate their contact with the whole place, never return to school, never return to the scene of the crime, to the place in which their behavior is punished. They might injure themselves. They might say horrible things about themselves. All of these, and they might comply. they might actually put their shoes on. All of these effects are main effects of punishment. What you're going to get when you punish the behavior is the form of behavior that has terminated similar aversive events in the past. So these are not side effects of punishment. These are the main effects of punishment. Punishment is going to evoke the emission of whatever form of behavior has terminated those events in the past. And that's why, when we start to punish behavior, we might see all of these. We might see, first of all, mutra, that the guy looks sad. Next, to start to scream. Next, to beat. When one behavior doesn't work, evokes the next thing. When the behavior has been extinguished in the past, but now appears in Yes. So we'll see behaviors that have been extinguished perhaps in the past. The person might say, "Mother, help me, this is a terrible situation." The mother's been dead for 10 years. The behaviors that have terminated these sorts of events in the past will tend to occur. What you get when you punish is what has terminated those sorts of events in the past. They're not side effects, they're main effects. You're going to get, the more you know about the history of the individual, the more you're going to know about what behavior you're going to get when you punish behavior. You'll get what you paid for. Okay. This analysis gives us, yes, thank you. This analysis gives us, you have to get something hot like my radiator. This gives us an opening to understand many aspects of behavior that heretofore behavior analysts don't study. And that's why I wanted to go to this slide here. Yes, this slide, back. This is areas of practice. This is from the BACB website. It shows areas of practice. What's that thing?
I have no idea.
It's a warning signal for punishment, I suppose.
Yes.
Let's terminate it. And we terminate the event. I feel relieved. Okay, this first of all, it's like almost 70% dealing with autism, another 12% or so with education, 8% with developmental disabilities, and much smaller for all of the rest of it. The smallest of all of these is non-university research. At 0.03% of registered behavior analysts are engaged in this activity. Where is psychotherapy? It's less than 0.03. We didn't even make the chart. And we're talking about aspects of behavior that not only occur in non-autistic population. I mean, they occur in hundreds of millions of people around the world. These are very, very common disruptive patterns of behavior. And of course, there are many behavior analysts that work in clinical psychology that are not BCBA. They're not certified behavior analysts. But why not? I mean, what's going on? Behavior analysts, certified behavior analysts, are not involved in the treatment of depression, in the treatment of anxiety, very, very common forms of behavior. And not only very, very common forms of behavior in non-clinical populations, also very, very common forms of behavior in autistic children. I mean, fear, anxiety, depression, sadness, and so forth. All of these appear in this population, and of course, they also appear in the parents of autistic children. When I was taking the BCBA exam some years ago, I read a guidebook for ethics. The guidebook describes the different scenarios, and in the back of the book it says what principle of the ethical code was violated or could be violated, what we should do in this situation. And I'm reading this book looking for a clinical example. Where's the clinical example? There were 2 examples about dog owners. but only one. Finally, I found one clinical example. What does it say? It says the parents of autistic children have been experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety. What should they do? Okay, what should they do? I go to the back of the book. The book says that behavior analysts don't engage in activities that they're not trained for, and we should refer the parents to a counselor. Now, why would it be an assumption that a behavior analyst knows nothing about helping the parents to deal with their depression and anxiety? There's lots of reasons for this. There's lots of historical reasons for this. But I would say one of the main reasons for this is that unless you have the kind of analysis of the effects of punishment that we've described here, that you're actually incapable of doing clinical work. I mean, with a definition of punishment that just says it decreases the frequency of behavior. Unless you analyze, you could have that definition and do all of the things that I've said you do, but you're not prompted to do so. And I don't think that you can understand these kinds of events because because all of the DSM classifications of psychopathology, all of that book describes patterns of behavior that lead to punishment. You cannot get in the DSM if always the last criterion is that all of the behaviors that we've described here are screwing up your life, are disrupting your ability to work, you're disrupting your relation with your family, your relations with other individuals. It's producing substantial difficulties in your life. So there's like a gambling disorder in the DSM. But the gambling disorder says I'm thinking about gambling all the time. I gamble all day long. And then it says, it has to bring economic and social difficulties. So if you're a successful gambler, you don't have a gambling disorder. I mean, if you're making money, and your spouse says, honey, it's 11 o'clock, aren't you going to go play poker? Under those circumstances, there's no disorder. So the important thing to understand is all of the book of psychopathology, including autism, are patterns of behavior that limit your horizons, that lead into the loss of resources or never gaining the resources in the first place, and in bad things happening in your life. So so basically, psychopathology is behavior that resists punishment. It resists punishment. So if you're still engaging in psychopathological behavior, despite the fact that it's screwing up your life, then why? Under what conditions are we seeing the continuation of exposure to aversive events? And one situation in which exposure to aversive events, punishment, does not disrupt our behavior. By the way, by the Asrin definition, that punishment didn't even occur. So we have to say that the whole book of psychopathology has nothing to do with punishment, because if the behavior is not changed by screwing up your life, then punishment has not occurred. So just, didactically, just in terms of semantically, in making, in explaining to people behavior analytic principles, that's a really big problem. Prison is not a punishment. Losing your friends is not a punishment if it doesn't have any effect on your behavior, if you still continue to engage in those kinds of behaviors. So what we have to think about, the basic problem for understanding psychopathology, is how is behavior maintained in the absence of, despite the fact that it's being punished. And the answer in almost all of those situations is that this behavior is being maintained as a form of avoidance. So other behaviors are being punished. So we're willing to accept this punishment. We accept this punishment as a way of terminating other threats. So and this is not a psychopathological process of itself, but can be if it occurs at a frequency and with respect to specific kinds of events. For example, we do this all the time. What happens is, this is a form of covert. Those were funny. That was funny. This is a form of covert aversive self-control. One way of terminating threats of punishment. Okay, here's the problem. You have to wait for the threat of punishment to occur in order to terminate if you had to wait for the punishment for the threat to occur, then you're going to get punished more often, because many times the threat doesn't come, perhaps, or you don't notice the threat, or more to the point, the threat occurs when you're at a big distance, when you're already approaching a reinforcer for this event. So if you think about leaving your stove on when you're already in Belfast and you live in Athens, then you're in a rather difficult situation. The warning signal for this behavior. Did I turn it off? The warning signal for this behavior is not occurring at a point in time that's convenient. That's going to be in time to terminate the threat of punishment. So what do we do in this situation? We threaten ourselves. We don't wait for this event. We produce an aversive event. So very often, and this is not pathological in itself. When if you want to park your car, you have an important appointment, and you go around the block 3-4 times, and the only space that's open is the handicap space. What are you going to do in this situation? You're going to lose the job. Your family's dependent on this, and so forth. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're first of all going to expose yourself to aversive events. You're going to say, well, if I take this space and a handicapped person comes, that's a very horrible thing to happen. If a cop comes and writes me a ticket, that's also nobody likes to be exposed to the idea of inconveniencing a person that's already having difficulties. Nobody likes to be exposed to the threat of losing a lot of money in a ticket. We're exposing ourselves to aversive events. Why? Because if we don't do it, we'll go ahead and park, and then those things will happen. So we expose ourselves to aversive events as a form of self-control. Self-control in the Skinnerian sense. There's not two of me. Self-control in the sense that I expose myself to a discriminative stimulus for an activity that increases the probability of engaging in that activity. So it's a way of bringing future events into the functional presence. We're producing threats for those events by our own behavior. If you ask a well-prepared student if they're ready for an examination, they'll always say, no, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. It's not nice to feel not ready. But why do we say we're not ready for an exam when we are ready for an exam? Because in the past, when we said we were ready for an exam and we failed the exam, then the stimuli that are produced because we think about it again, gosh, I'm so stupid. I told myself that I was ready. I wasn't ready. And then I failed this exam. We're reproducing those same sorts of events. And now, when I'm studying, of course, one reinforcer to be done. Because then I can go to sleep, or I can go out, or engage in any other sort of activity. But I tell myself that I'm not ready as a way of increasing the probability of study. So I acquire a tendency to tell myself I'm not ready to study as a way of self-exposure to aversive events that will evoke a continuation of the behavior that indeed eventually cancels the punishment. That's not the reason. That's not the functional event. The functional event is the termination of self-produced warning signals for punishment. Well, this can get out of hand. So an anorexic person, for example, looks in the mirror and says, I'm fat. It's not nice to feel, I'm overweight, there's a problem here. These are aversive events. Why would the person expose themselves to aversive events? Well, because if the person has a history of looking at themselves and saying, I look fine, then I'm not going to go to the gym, I'm going to go to the pastry shop. There's nothing to stop me. There's no events evoking an incompatible behavior with eating a highly caloric food. So it's a technique of self-control. I expose myself to aversive events as a way of, I expose myself to the threat as a way of increasing the probability of the kind of behavior that I want. And if that gets out of hand, if the threat of gaining weight is so salient and so powerful, then we get the situation described as anorexia. And this is a so-called body dysmorphic disorder, where the person looks at themselves, they're emaciated, but their perception is that they're heavy. Well, we've done some research on that, experimental research on that in our laboratory. First of all, what we do is the person has to compare. We have a photograph of the person, and they have to compare that photograph to one of 200 different photographs that we have of other women. This is all women in this particular study. And what they have, we know their body mass, and we know the body mass of the other person in the picture. And we ask them, how much weight would I have to gain or lose in order to have a similar figure with the other person in the picture? And we can calculate, because we know the difference in body mass, what the actual difference has to be. Well, heavier women tend to underestimate how much weight they would have to lose to look the same as the other women. And lighter women tend to overestimate. They overestimate how emaciated they are. They say that they see themselves as thinner than they actually are, even though in our culture that's probably an aversive event. The way that you see yourself, the perception of yourself, is exposure to aversive events or termination of exposure to aversive events. Because if a person is so heavy that they have a health problem, but they tend to not see that, that's also a way of terminating self-produced aversive events. Look in the mirror and say, I'm fine. That terminates your contact with that event. Or look in the mirror and say, I need to do something about this situation. And those two behaviors have very different sequelae in terms of the kinds of behaviors that are going to occur in the life of the individual at that point in time. Finally, this sort of private behavior that we're talking about, this is of course all scientific interpretation, where none of this about the private behavior has been tested, but we can see the effects on what people, because what we do in the laboratory is then we differentially reinforce seeing yourself as heavier relative to others and seeing yourself as lighter relative to others. And within session, without the subject to understand themselves, they start seeing, because in one case we punish seeing yourself as heavier and reinforcing yourself as lighter. And in the other case, we do the opposite. And the behavior, the self-perception, follows the differential reinforcement and punishment under these circumstances. Highly reliable, reproducible within subjects, and nobody understands the manipulation. And it generalizes when we give them the same pictures after that manipulation. It generalizes to the other situation. It's changing the effect of their own image on their behavior by differential reinforcement and punishment under these circumstances. Now, this kind of behavior, because it's private, is especially sensitive to adventitious contingencies. So, for example, think about somebody that's waiting for a bus station, waiting for a bus, and this person is actually very attracted. It's a man, and is very attracted to other men, but never engages in this behavior because if he even thinks about doing it, it makes him very scared, and terminates these behaviors by thinking something else, by changing tune. Because of punishment of this kind of behavior in our society, the unacceptability of many individuals, then the stimuli produced by thinking about making love to a man are elicit fear and evoke the emission of behavior that's incompatible with that. So this man is sitting waiting for a bus, and a very attractive looking man comes and sits next to him. And he might be attractive for a second, but immediately then he's going to say, this is a bad guy. What the hell does this guy want from me? A little paranoid type person. Anyway, let's say there's a history of paranoid thinking. So he thinks, is he from the CIA? Is he from MI3? Which one is it? I don't know. Is he from 5? MI5? Okay. Is he a thief? And maybe he knows that I'm hiding all my money in the mattress, and he's trying to take advantage of me. Maybe he's a homosexual, and he's going to flirt with me, and then cycles back through it again. And if he comes to the point where, and all of this time, he's just staring intently at the person. Which one is he? What is this guy trying to do to me? The guy's trying to read his newspaper. He's having a little difficulty there. But, under this intense pressure, at some point in time, he closes the newspaper and goes away, eliminating the threat, eliminating the threat for this individual. So the behavior that actually terminated the threat was staring at the guy. If he hadn't stared at him all of that time, he would have been still sitting next to him. The behavior that actually terminated it was the motor behavior. But all that same point in time, the person was thinking different kinds of things, and when he thought that the guy was, for example, from the CIA, the guy got up and left. He says, another agent. So what gets reinforced is the privately observable behavior, and nobody sees that. But now, the next time that a similar situation will occur, the next attractive man that sits next to him will have a higher probability of evoking, as an SD, thinking about the CIA. And then when again staring at this individual withers him and makes him walk away, again reinforcement of the same kind of event. Go for the first time and of course thinking about the CIA was not effective at all. It was completely adventitiously reinforced, because Staring at the person would have been effective if he had thought about the CIA, if he had thought about the guy flirting with him, if he hadn't thought anything at all. If he thought, if he was just staring at the guy and was thinking, did I leave the kitchen stove on? Even then, and then if the guy got up and left, then I would think, yes, leave the kitchen stove on. And that's how we get obsessive compulsive behavior. So, again, a threatening situation. I'm at a first date. I've made up some things to say on this first date. I've said all of those things, and still nothing. The person that's having the date with me is looking around. What's going on here? My mother's been telling me, look, you're 30 years old. You've got to get this thing going here. So it's a very aversive situation, and I'm very frightened. And all of this time, I'm just grabbing onto the corners of the table, and then suddenly I realize that this is a restaurant, which means other people have been eating here, putting their hands in their mouth, and they've also been touching this table, and there's no tablecloth on this table. Oh my God, maybe I have become contaminated here. And then I would say to my opponent, in this case, I would say, please excuse me for a moment. I'm going to the restroom. The restroom is the last refuge of humanity. Anything else that's going on, nobody says, no, you cannot escape when you want to go to the restroom. So the person gets up, walks away, and leaves the table. Of course, the behavior that was effective in terminating the threat, because the threat is the girl that I'm having this conversation with, the behavior that terminated the threat was getting up and walking away, right? But it immediately followed on the discrimination that I might be affected. And so, in fact, it was the presence of the infection, that the thought, the stimuli produced by the thought of the contamination that are paired with the termination of the threat. And so, next time that I'm in a similar situation, I'm going to probably think again about contamination, and immediately again terminate with an independent action, with a motor action, my contact with these sorts of aversive events. What happens then? I go to the bathroom. I'm relieved. I'm delivered from this horrible situation. I go into the men's room. When you go into the men's room, you have to know you have to do something. You can't just hang out in there. So what does the person do? The person washes his hands, and then gets ready to leave, but says, well, maybe I'm not exactly clean yet, extending, terminating again, because if you go to leave the room, then you're going back into the field of battle here. So you say, maybe the hands, so as long as I'm washing my hands, I'm safe. And then, the thought that I'm now free of contamination is going to be paired with going back into battle. So there's punishment of the thought that I'm free of contamination, and reinforcement of the thought that I'm contaminated. Excuse me, under these situations, if I start to think very often, I got to go and wash my hands, and I'll go and wash my hands more often in threatening, different kinds of threatening situations. They all make sense. All of these behaviors make sense, and the process is adaptive. It's not that you're crazy if you're doing that. It means you're a human being. It means that you have the kind of organism that under situations of threat, the stimuli that brought you into that threatening situation are going to acquire negative reinforcing potency, such that determination of those events will be reinforced. And you can't always depend upon the environment to give you the threat in time. But the great thing about private behavior is you're free to produce a threat to yourself at any point in time. You're free. You can. It requires no environmental support. You can produce a threat anytime that you want to, which means that you can produce that threat at a safe distance from the reinforcer, because this is a battle between the negative and positive reinforcers here. Remember, the behavior is positively reinforced. The guy in the bus station wants to have sex with this guy. And if he doesn't warn himself, if he doesn't get himself out of this situation, who knows what he's going to do? He's a really good-looking guy. So I have to do something in this situation to extract myself from this situation. If I don't get a threat from any place else, then I'll give this threat to myself. These kinds of explanations make very good sense to people very readily, without a history of behavior analytic training. If you describe these things just in terms of the events that occur, because everybody already has the data. Everybody's already seen what's happening in this situation. They just don't know the order of the data. And so, for me, the most important thing that we can do in psychotherapy is help people to understand that their behavior is normal, which creates great relief. That anybody would be expected to behave in a similar way in this situation. I'm way over time now. Anybody would behave in a similar way in this situation, and we understand the source of these events. So that changes the effect of these events on the individual. The next time that you start to engage in this behavior, you remember the conditions that give rise to these sorts of events. It evokes analysis. Instead of eliciting more fear under these situations. There's nothing to me more powerful that we can do, more effective that we can do in psychotherapy than help the person to understand the determination of their thoughts, feelings, interpretations, and actions. And that's basically what I was hoping to share with you today.
What we'll do, we'll have a bit more time for questions.
Oh, good.
But what we'll do, we'll bring in the food, and people maybe want to help themselves with some food and eat while we ask questions.
Yes.
The other thing we also have is CEUs for anybody. Make sure that you give me any other BCBAs in the room. Identify yourself or forever hold your peace.
Yes, sir.
It's supposed to just shock schedules, like how our film film.
Yes.
How does that fit in? How do you fit that into your...
What?
It's supposed to just shock schedules.
Yes.
Is everybody fine?
Because I did some other shock stuff with that.
You go.
And whenever I was training a rat